Hi, and welcome to Digital Defense. My name is Jordan Robertson. I'm a cybersecurity reporter here for Bloomberg News in Washington, D.C. This is our weekly cybersecurity web show. We're broadcasting live on Facebook, Periscope, the Terminal, and Bloomberg.com. This is an interactive show, so anybody with questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section of wherever you're watching this webcast, or tweet to us at Technology. That's the Bloomberg Technology Twitter page, and we will answer as many of your questions as we can today. So the topic of this week's show is Russian cyber attacks on the U.S. election. It's a topic regular viewers of this show will know that I've covered quite frequently, but we were able to add, we think, significantly to the discussion this week with a major story we broke about how the attacks were wider than previously known. For those of you who've seen this story, this will be a recap, but for those of you who didn't, earlier this week, a colleague of mine, Mike Riley, and I broke a story stating that Russian computer attackers compromised election systems in at least 39 states across the United States, leading up to President Trump's election. The significance of this is we had heard previously, and it had previously been reported, that as many as 20 states had compromises of various election-related systems in their states. What our reporting showed is that number was not only significantly higher, but also, just as crucially, the U.S. government found evidence that the Russian attackers tried to alter or delete data in at least one state, indicating their motive and suggesting their motive, which is to tamper with voter registration databases and cause chaos at the polls. Now, again, regular viewers of the show will know that this issue of voter registration database integrity is a really critical one to our electoral systems. In some ways, in many ways, even more important than the systems that actually count the votes. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about that on the show. But again, regular viewers will know that this is a topic both near and dear to my heart, as well as a very high priority for U.S. government officials in terms of ensuring that that any hackers, Russian or otherwise, are not able to tamper with the integrity of our system. And unfortunately, as I think the story suggests and makes pretty clear, we don't have a really good handle on how deeply our electoral systems were penetrated in 2016. I think that's just the bottom line. If you take nothing else away from the show, I want you to take that away, that while this story we think is a good one and adds a lot to the discussion, the really important thing to remember is that this is a snapshot. And the reason this information is valuable right now is we don't really know how far these attackers got and what they were capable of doing. We have some clues, but this is something we're really going to need to watch very closely going forward, especially into 2018 and 2020, the midterms and the next presidential elections, because what essentially happened here was a massive reconnaissance operation by the Russians to figure out how our election systems work. And that information is not going to go away. That information is going to be very valuable to any groups of attackers who decide to come back in the future. So to recap, again, this is an audience-driven show, so I want you to write in with any questions. We got a lot of feedback about this story, so any questions you have about this story, please feel free to send them in, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. There are a lot of interesting technical discussions to have around this story that we published. The biggest one is kind of a point of clarification. A number of folks asked us, so 39 states, does that mean that 39 state databases were compromised? We don't really go into it in the story, but we can go into it here. It's an important distinction. What the story states is that electoral systems, which include primarily voter registration systems, but also campaign finance databases, both of which are really critical to the proper functioning of an electoral system, those systems were compromised in at least 39 states. And those systems do not have to be statewide databases. In fact, in many cases, the county systems are far more valuable from a hacker's perspective for a very critical reason. In the early 2000s, the federal government passed a law, the Help America Vote Act, and this required states and gave money to states to modernize their electoral systems. It provided money for electronic voting machines and electronic vote tabulators, as well as requirements that states maintain an online database that helps people register to vote, but also maintains the records, those voter rolls, on a statewide level, so that states can swap data and figure out when people have died, when people have moved. It's very expensive to maintain voter rolls when they just keep growing and growing and people are not deleted when they either die or move. So that was the stated goal of that legislation, and that led to every state having these massive statewide databases. The reason I make this point in this show is that compromising one of those state databases, and we have a few examples to discuss here, is not necessarily the best way for an attacker to compromise the vote. The reason is counties run elections. States don't run these elections generally. Counties run these elections even if it is a statewide or a national contest. So what that means is, if you're an attacker, and in this case the Russians, of course, know this, if you're an attacker, attacking the statewide database only gets you so far. Where you really would like to be as an attacker, and where these attackers were in many cases, are the county and local systems which actually prepare the ballots and actually administer these elections. If what you're trying to do is delete names, delete addresses, alter information, so that when people go to the polls, they're not able to vote, that lines stretch out the door and the lines last for hours. If what you're trying to do is create chaos, you attack at the county and the local level. So it's a really important point to make. We've seen a lot of follow-up reporting where reporters will call the Secretary of State of whatever state they're in, and they'll say, hey, we weren't hacked, we didn't get an alert. There are some reasons for that, potential reasons for that, but it's really important to note county and local systems are where the action is and where the real threat is. I want to walk you through one example, and again, broadcasting live here on Facebook, the terminal, Bloomberg.com. Anybody with questions, please feel free to write them in the comments section. We'll get to as many of those as we can. Or tweet to us at Technology. That's the Bloomberg Technology page. And we'll see your questions, and we'll be able to answer in real time there. The one main example that I want to walk you through, I'll show you a couple of different slides here. This obviously was a story we did earlier this week. This was from a leaked National Security Agency document that came out not too long before that outlines the NSA's assessment of some of these election-related attacks. It's a very interesting document. The federal government has arrested the person that they believe is responsible for leaking this to a publication called The Intercept. But this document contains enormous public value. The public service of this disclosure, in my view, is actually very high. For this reason alone, we've been consumed in this country with all of the drama surrounding the new administration and various investigations into alleged Russian collusion. What this document does, and what we think our reporting does, is refocus at least part of that debate and part of that discussion on, well, what exactly do we know about what happened during the election? Was it just leaked emails, or was it actual tampering of voter rolls? And we think we've made a pretty strong argument that tampering of voter systems is actually much wider than anybody publicly previously knew. So we're getting some questions here. Thanks for sending those in. Again, we encourage as many of these as we can get to during the show. First question here is there any way that the media or polling stations were also in on it? Not sure I fully understand the question, but if what the question is asking is there any way that the media or polling stations, I think we need to split those up. If what the person is asking is, are the people who are running polling stations behind any potential manipulation of votes, I think we should start with the baseline that we have no evidence that actual votes were altered in this way. It's a really important point to make. It's one that former FBI Director James Comey made in his testimony to Congress not too long ago. And we have no evidence that actual votes were tampered with. The point of our story, and really I think the thing that everybody needs to focus on when we think about Russian attempts to both perform surveillance on our election systems as well as potentially tamper with our election, the main point is that voter registration databases are really where the most damage could be done most easily. And that's what our story states. Voter registration and campaign finance databases are the real targets. So if this person is asking, are poll workers in on any potential fraud? We've seen lots of examples of that in the past. Those are usually local, more local examples. It's hard to manage a giant, vast conspiracy to tamper votes, especially in person. However, digitally, there are ways to do it, but I think the idea that poll workers may have been involved in tampering with votes, we haven't seen any evidence of that so far. Getting some good questions here. The next question is, what concrete proof do we have that Russia successfully hacked election systems? Very good question. One of the reasons I brought this this image to remind viewers of today. Again, to kind of buttress our report, to support our reporting, this document that was leaked, and again, the U.S. government has arrested someone who they believe leaked this classified national security document to The Intercept, an online publication. There is enormous public value in this document, and in this document, as well as many other public statements by various intelligence agencies of the U.S. government, they have concluded, and I'll show you in a slide here, that it was the Russian GRU, that's military intelligence for Russia, was behind these attacks. I should note, some of these attacks were not necessarily sophisticated. Some were more sophisticated. Some were super sophisticated. In general, though, what this was a reconnaissance attack on election systems. Again, according to the U.S. government and according to this leaked NSA document, as well as sanctions the U.S. government has imposed on certain Russian individuals and organizations for alleged crimes related to this election hacking, that's where the attribution comes from. And could it be misleading? Could it be false? Sure, but this is pretty good information that this attribution is accurate. And that the Russian specifically military intelligence, which you can see here, the GRU, it's a little small, but that's the attribution from the U.S. government. Next question here is, why were some states targeted and others were not? Another good question. I think we should make a point that, especially in reporting, it's always a game of partial information. You'll almost never get the full picture when you're reporting out a story. You'll get pieces of it. And we think, and that's especially true even on the other side, on the investigative side. A point I've made pretty frequently over the past week is that while we've reported that the U.S. government, specifically the Department of Homeland Security, got indications that this same group of Russian hackers were on these election systems in at least 39 states. The key phrase there is at least 39 states. So we've talked to other folks who say it's foolish to believe that there were states that were left off this list. When the Russian hackers were planning these attacks, it's likely that they might have focused on areas where they felt they could be most effective. But as for a reconnaissance mission, you want to gather as much information as you can about as many targets as you can, because you never know what's going to be useful. So I wouldn't even necessarily say that these 39 states were targeted because they're uniquely important. I think our entire election system was targeted, and it's possible maybe they just had more luck getting into certain systems or spent more time and effort on certain places. But in response to this question, I would add that it's pretty clear that in U.S. elections, there are a handful of states who matter more than others, who are considered really key swing states: Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, a few others, where the votes that get sent to the Electoral College really matter more than other states, and that's because these are considered swing states. So if I were a Russian hacker, I would be targeting those states. Obviously, I'm not, but I think it's fair to deduce from the significance of those states to our electoral system that there are a handful of states that would be targeted more than others simply for their ability to swing elections, almost absolutely. A couple more questions here. These are really good ones, so again, please feel free to send any more questions that come to your mind. We've got a lot of good ones going here. Question here is, what has been misrepresented throughout this entire investigation? Are there any big misconceptions? Sure, I think one of the big misconceptions is that anyone has a full picture of how deeply our electoral systems were penetrated. As a cybersecurity reporter, we see this all the time. You're only going to get as much visibility into an attack as you're looking for. If you're not looking for indications of Russian hackers, state-sponsored GRU top-level hackers on your system, if you're not doing that at a county and local level, which, let's face it, almost none of them are. Almost none of these counties and municipalities even have an IT staff. If you think about who's running these systems, we have thousands and thousands of these systems throughout the United States. They're all different, and they're all administered locally. You're lucky if you have a part-time contractor who does that work and who does that maintenance and scanning and all those things. So I think the biggest misconception is that we know for sure what the level of penetration was into our electoral system. We think the value of the story that we published shows that there were indications of compromise, and again, compromise, not just attempted attacks, but actual infections on voter reg and campaign finance databases in at least 39 states. But that is such a snapshot, that is such a partial view, and this was the view within the US government. So there's a lot more to be learned about what the extent of this penetration was. And it's my hope that as these investigations proceed into alleged Russian collusion and the Trump administration and things like that, that we also look at what was the extent of this attack, because we just don't know. And the US government, as far as we know, doesn't know either at this point. Next question here is, were more people turned away from polling stations than usual? Well, something that any reporter would like to know, and a lot of people are looking at, is did any of this tampering lead to actual manipulation of voter registration rolls? The only evidence that we have was from Illinois, from one state, where federal investigators and working with state investigators in Illinois found evidence, digital forensic evidence, on the servers and in their network traffic that the attackers were trying to alter names, addresses, and other fields in the voter registration rolls. The significance of that is, you can imagine, you go up to vote at your designated polling station and you're not in the rolls. Somebody else who lives at your address with a different name, maybe a different date of birth, they're registered to vote, but that person doesn't exist. So you can imagine, even if you're able to vote provisionally, the chaos that that would create when you're trying to vote. And if you do that on a mass scale in one of these swing states, let's say you just knocked out voter registration applications in all of those states and thousands of people were not able to vote, that would be a really successful attack. Now, people have been turned away from the polls increasingly for lots of different reasons, one of them being efforts in certain states that the critics would say amount to voter suppression, making it harder for people, particularly in the inner city and particularly in minority communities, to vote. Those are very real concerns that are also happening, but we have no indication yet that any of that was related to voter registration tampering. Now, it'd be a nice smokescreen if you were a hacker to do that in a place that's already experiencing, like Arizona, North Carolina, and other places that have implemented these really strict voter ID laws, which again, critics would say amount to voter suppression. That would be a nice smokescreen if you were an attacker looking to manipulate the rolls. Again, we don't have evidence of that, but just thinking out loud, this is something that investigators and all of us, frankly, should be watching out for into the future. Another question here, really good questions today. Please keep them coming. Do you think this investigation would be in the spotlight as much if Hillary won? Let me think about that. It's a good question, because one of the reasons we've heard that the Obama administration, and we've reported, was so kind of standoffish about really confronting this Russian hacking threat as the US government became aware of it, was that it was widely assumed that Hillary was going to win. Most of the polls showed that. It was clear from the body language and the consensus view, whatever that means within Washington, was that this race was Hillary Clinton's to lose. So there was a certain perspective in the Obama White House that confronting this threat too publicly and too overtly and too strongly might be seen as putting your thumb on the scale of the election. So it's understandable, on one hand, to consider why that may have been the view. Obviously, in hindsight, what you see is, I think many of us would have liked the administration to confront this a little bit more aggressively and a little more assertively, and that would have helped lead this investigation further into a potential Clinton administration. But I think this would have been an issue. I think this would have been more of an issue had Clinton won, because this is an attack on our national infrastructure. This is a national security issue. And part of the reason this is so controversial now is, as we saw from Attorney General Jeff Sessions' testimony earlier this week before the Senate Intelligence Committee, he confessed that he hasn't even asked for a briefing on this issue. So a lot of members of the public and reporters and others are saying, why is nobody looking into this as part of these big investigations into potential collusion with Russia? So I actually think this would have been an even bigger issue had Hillary won. That's a personal opinion, but this is a national security issue that you would hope, as Americans, that any administration would take very seriously. And a lot of people are scratching their heads at why the Trump administration seems so intent on making this something that is not investigated. So it's possible and likely that this is going to become part of these ongoing Russia investigations. We know it's part of the FBI investigation at the very least. Lots of good questions today. Our country is so advanced. How does this happen to us and not other less technologically advanced nations? I think our detections are better than in many places, but when you talk about being an advanced country, sure, we have created many of the technologies that power the internet around the world. But as far as advanced, our electoral system is far from advanced. The technology, we've done stories on this in the past, where the technology that underpins our electoral system is actually very ancient. It is not updated. You're talking about 10, 15-year-old PCs and servers in some of these places. Problem with that is this is software that's not updated. This is custom software who the creators have literally died, and there's nobody left to support some of this stuff. So while the U.S. may be the technological engine for the world, when it comes to electoral systems, our technology is far from advanced. But that being said, when companies and when states decide to look for efforts to hack these systems, we're really good at detecting that. We've got very, very good cybersecurity technology available to anybody who's willing to pay for it. And in this case, the U.S. government, the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, went out to states and municipalities and counties and said, work with us, we'll help you detect attacks on your systems. And that's how some of this information was gathered. The 39 states was through Department of Homeland Security alerts, a centralized alerting system. But that, again, that's a partial view. So we have better ways of alerting on some of these things, but you have to be looking for it. So I would say, and I'll tell you something funny too, we've talked to a lot of voting experts over the years about what do you do about this problem? Is it possible to make completely secure digital voting? And what the best minds in this industry say is technology is great, technology can help you count votes, technology can help people register more easily. But what you need at the end of the day is still a paper ballot that is counted by a machine. That's the best system because you can always recount the paper ballot. This move to an entirely digital system, in many states, I mean more than a dozen states, do not have a paper trail of who voted for, of how people have voted. That makes recounts literally impossible in some places. So we're headed toward a system where too much reliance on technology is not going to be necessarily to our advantage when it comes to ferreting out whether we've had issues or not. Next question, knowing that hackers can easily mask their IP address, how do we know it was Russia and not another country? Well, again, I would go back to the U.S. government's attribution, U.S. and other governments' attribution of these attacks as well. What the government gets when it creates an attribution like the GRU, the Russian GRU, hacked our electoral system, they're not just talking about public indicators of compromise. These are fingerprints, digital fingerprints on the malware, on the servers these attackers used. When the NSA or other government bodies make this assessment, most often what they're basing that on, if not all the time, are classified indicators of compromise, things that are not out in the public, things that are not traded on the dark web. So malware samples as well as attack infrastructure, computers and accounts, things that the U.S. government has linked to specific actors in these groups. So whenever you see these attribution, a lot of people will look at it and say, well, if malware is out there and widely used, it can be repurposed. And it is, and that's a totally valid point. But when the government makes these kinds of attributions to this level of specificity, what you're most likely seeing is attribution based on classified indicators of compromise. And those are by definition much more specific than anything on the public market. Is it true the U.S. polling systems are built on really old technology? Yes, I just mentioned that. They are. The voter registration systems are built on very old technology. They don't have to be super sophisticated. They just have to be maintained. These are just databases. They're ordinary databases. But they sit inside systems, county systems, that in many cases are poorly, if not protected, if protected not at all. And again, many counties have a contractor who maybe comes in a couple times a week, couple times a month to administer and maintain these systems. So think about that when you think about the Russian GRU, military intelligence, the equivalent of our NSA or your DOD attacking a system that has somebody who comes in a couple times a week or a month to maintain it. You think about who's going to win that battle. It's the access is the hard question here. What can we do going forward to protect the integrity of voting procedures in 2018 and 2020? Well, this is what I'm hoping is one of the results of our reporting and others, and I hope lots of other reporters are kind of focused on this issue now, is because we really need to figure out where these attackers were and where can other attackers get to. Because again, it's not about the voting machines. And I've been saying this for a couple years now, but voting machines are hackable, but they're very hard to hack. And not only are they hard to hack, they're hard to manipulate votes in ways that are not discoverable. The example I like to give is if hackers had tampered with the voting machines in Texas, let's say, or any other red state that reliably goes for the Republican candidate, and they flipped it to Hillary, everybody would know something's wrong, and they'd go in and they'd look. That's not a successful hack. So what we need to do is figure out where have these attackers been able to get access to voter registration systems. Forget the actual voting systems for now. Voter registration systems, where do hackers have access to the point that they can actually manipulate data? Again, in Illinois they tried, but they weren't successful. We have no idea, at least publicly, based on our information, how many systems foreign hackers or even domestic hackers, but hackers period, have access that they're going to be able to manipulate in the future. And that's going to require a lot of cooperation and a lot of work and money on behalf of any entity, any agency that administers a voter registration or a campaign finance system. Hard problem, big problem, but one I think is important to the national security. Next question here is, does the fact that the U.S. voting system is decentralized make it easier or harder for a foreign adversary to hack? The reason I like this question is it speaks to, there's a thread of conventional wisdom that runs through any discussion about the U.S. election system, which I think is potentially misleading. And it is this idea that you'll hear every security expert say, because the U.S. election system is so decentralized, 7,000 or more different systems throughout the country that manage various parts of this process, from voter registration to ballot preparation, to actual voting, to campaign finance, and on and on and on. That makes it more costly to attack. That makes it harder in the sense that you have more targets to attack, but that doesn't make it harder in the sense of difficulty of getting onto these systems. In fact, it makes it easier to get on many of these systems because, again, going back to the county that has somebody that comes in a couple times a month, those systems are just not going to have great security. That's not what they're designed for. And the problem becomes, if you as an attacker can identify a voter registration system that not only allows you to get inside of it, but also to change those fields, you know, you're talking about chaos at the polls. And thankfully, we didn't see that this election. Unfortunately for the U.S., where we did see significant delays, we're in areas where we've created this problem ourselves. We've implemented laws such as voter ID and other things that have made it harder for people to vote, primarily inner city residents and people in minority communities. That's a problem of our own creation. That's a policy problem in many of these places. But you can absolutely extend that idea, the exact same idea, to what happens if a hacker manipulates the voter rolls in the same way. The result is that you'd have chaos at the polls, and it's impossible to overstate the degree to which that was the goal of these attacks. It's not necessarily to put one candidate over another in office, although it's been pretty clear based on the reporting that we and others have done, was that Russia wanted Trump in office. Moscow viewed Trump as the favored candidate. But I think it'd be misleading to believe that just because that was true, that the end goal is to put a Republican in office or something like that, or a Democrat, or vice versa. The goal is to destabilize the electoral system and creating issues like these where you can't trust email. And one of the big results of the DNC email leaks was the fact that a lot of Democratic voters felt really wounded that Bernie Sanders basically had the institution of the Democratic Party, whose nomination he was running for, in black and white, working against him. Undermining integrity and the confidence in our system, whether it's through email leaks like that cause voters to be disaffected, or tampering with voter registration rolls, which again, thankfully, we don't have any evidence yet that we saw in 2016. These are all efforts to destabilize confidence and undermine confidence in the system, and that's what we really need to be looking at going forward into 2018 and 2020. And there's no way we can do that without actually figuring out where these hackers were and where do they have access to do the kinds of things that we're discussing today. So as you can tell, it's a subject I'm passionate about. I think it's really interesting. We've written some really great stories in the past. We wrote about a Colombian election hacker who really taught us a lot about how this worked and the significance of voter registration databases versus actual voting machines in terms of creating chaos at the polls. And it's my hope that through this show, again, regular viewers will know this, that we can reframe some of this discussion so that the investigations can be better informed as well, because we're all trying to figure out our way through this together. And this was a real watershed moment for us as a country. Certainly the U.S. is no stranger to tampering with elections in other countries, but in terms of having it targeted at us, this is a big problem that we really need to take seriously. And it's my hope that some of this reporting will help focus some of those efforts as well. With that, we've got to wrap, but thank you to everybody who watched and sent in questions. We love getting really good questions like that. Again, I'm on every week, Thursday at noon Eastern. The program is Digital Defense. If you want to tweet me any questions offline, happy to take a look at those. My Twitter is @JordanR1000, JORDAN, the letter R1000. You can tweet to us @Technology as well. That's the Bloomberg Technology Twitter page. And please check out Bloomberg.com/technology. We've got a couple of great shows like this. A colleague, Mark Gurman, runs a show called Gadgets with Gurman. And we also have a great podcast called Decrypted, which I encourage you to check out. We touch on some of these subjects as well periodically. With that, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week on Digital Defense, again, broadcasting live from Washington, D.C. at 12 noon Eastern. Thanks for watching.